Я включил.
Все, тогда начинаем. Здравствуйте, дорогие участники, дорогие гости. Здравствуйте те из вас, кто присоединились к нам через нашу трансляцию на канале Facebook, на странице «Три точки. Знай, что смотришь». Если вы по какой-то случайной причине зашли на эту страницу и не подписались, подпишитесь, и вы будете следить за очень интересным, уникальным контентом вместе с нами. А сегодня мы все собрались, чтобы участвовать на данной сессии, в рамках которого мы будем презентовать результаты нашего исследования, которое мы проводили вместе с нашими партнерами. Так получилось в период пандемии, поэтому по самой сути это был очень сложный проект, очень сложная задача, но мы с ней справились. И свежие результаты, свежие находки, наши свежие рекомендации мы попытаемся вместе с нашими спикерами сегодня вместе с вами поделиться. Помимо этого, в течение нашей сегодняшней сессии у нас будет определенный слот, когда вы сможете задать любые ваши вопросы, дать свои комментарии. Для этого всего у нас доступен чат. Для всех из вас, кто у нас сейчас находится в Zoom, пишите ваши вопросы и комментарии в чат. Если же вы хотите голосом выступить, то просто поднимите руку. Эта функция доступна в Zoom, и мы дадим вам слово. Те из вас, кто присоединился через Facebook, пишите ваши вопросы или же комментарии в комменты. Это получается на этом экране или снизу, или справа, или слева. У того, как это все будет отображаться. Итак, поэтому я хотел бы теперь непосредственно перейти уже к самому нашему ивенту. И на этом моменте, как я уже говорил и предупреждал, я переключусь на английский язык. Спасибо. So, I'm happy to welcome you at the online launch event that will present findings of the regional research carried out by the European Neighbourhood Council in cooperation with Internews across Central Asia. So today's meeting is organized by the ENC and Internews within the European-funded project Strengthening Resilience to Radicalization and Disinformation in Central Asia, which is implemented by Internews across Central Asian region. So before going deep into the results of our research and discussing the findings, I would like to give the floor for the opening remarks to our honorable guests. So I would like to invite Ambassador Peter Buyan, European Union Special Representative for Central Asia. Please, Ambassador Buyan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Farhad. I hope you can hear me. Do you hear me? Well, okay, great. First of all, good morning and greetings from Brussels. Dobré утро, salam alaikum, особенно для наших друзей из Центральной Азии. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, thank you for inviting me for this interesting discussion. I'm glad to join you in this very important event. And at the outset, I wish to commend the FPI for supporting this important and timely project on strengthening resilience to radicalization and disinformation in Central Asia through independent media. And in particular, Internews and the European Neighbourhood Council for conducting the study on information consumption among vulnerable communities with a view of identifying vulnerabilities and risk of social exclusion and inequalities as drivers of radicalization. I'm pleased to note that in spite of pandemic, all our events are actually going on, unfortunately not in person. But we managed to reestablish the communication in spite of all these travel restrictions, and we have a very active season rich on discussions on how to translate the priorities of the EU strategy on Central Asia into practical steps and result-oriented cooperation for strengthening resilience, prosperity, and regional cooperation in Central Asia as important factors of stability and sustainable development of the region. Those three areas are key priorities of the strategy for those who haven't had the opportunity to read it. Just within 1 month, we had several important events in our interregional dialogue with Central Asia, very high level. EU Central Asia Economic Forum on September 7, EU Central Asia Ministerial Meeting on November 17th, And last but not least, a second EU Central Asia Civil Society Forum, in which many of you have participated in the end of October. This is, in my view, a very concrete confirmation of a new dynamism and content in our discussion and in our cooperation with Central Asia, involving all segments of society, governments, parliaments, private sector, civil society, including researchers, youth, women, media, persons with disabilities, including. I'm pleased to know that, in particular, Civil Society Forum has become a stable element of our architecture for interregional dialogue, and it has clearly demonstrated its value. The most urgent theme discussed, which is not a surprise in the forum, but also during the economic forum and the ministerial meeting, has been post-COVID-19 recovery as an opportunity to do things differently, to build back better. The discussion at the forum provided ample valuable insights and experience looking into how COVID-19 tested resilience of Central Asian countries and your societies. What is even more important, that it has generated many important suggestions, ideas on how the civil society can be better involved in the processes of implementation of the EU strategy on Central Asia. I would like to inform you that those recommendations and ideas were presented, as we promised, to Central Asian ministers by High Representative Borrell during the meeting of ministers, as I mentioned, in November. We want to build on this and develop this platform as continued structured process. You suggested to have some thematic working groups, roundtables. So we would like to continue, but the leadership is on your side. But I believe also your project will pave the way for a very concrete process and discussion on this particular topic, how to address problems of vulnerable persons and groupings. So we would like to once again involve all stakeholders in shaping our responses and programs of cooperation to better reflect your needs and existing realities. Now, let me briefly highlight some important observations from the discussion which we had during the forum and which are also very relevant for our discussion today. In presenting lessons learned and best practices, the participants of the forum emphasized that post-COVID recovery, while being very challenging, presents a number of unique opportunities, as I mentioned. And we really want to look to the crisis as an opportunity, once again, not as a problem. First of all, it offers the opportunity to focus on a people-centered recovery, namely to focus on inclusion and well-being, not least of vulnerable groups, which have been worst affected by the pandemic. Secondly, the current crisis requires us to think how to do things differently. I mentioned how to build back better, but really looking to the opportunity to create out-of-the-box formats and introduce new digital technologies, for instance, and new ideas for civil society activities. Thirdly, the pandemic has shown that on some issues, the EU might need to radically rethink its approach, which might be also needed to inquire about solutions in places and communities where we have never looked before. And this is exactly what your research is doing or has done already. In view of the widening scope of the current challenges and the consequent need of new ideas about how to best approach them, the European Union needs to expand the range of civil society organizations that it engages with in Central Asia and include local organizations that are less familiar with international development cooperation, because we really need to have those who need us, who really are less probably familiar with our values and our processes, because it is very important not to have only a small group of people involved in this process, but rather involve the whole society approach. In helping to leverage the important role that civil society in Central Asia plays in addressing societal challenges, the EU should step up efforts to promote and support participation of civil society in public decision-making. I'm pleased to see that it's happening, but more needs to be done in individual countries. And of course, the level of involvement differs from country to country. And we know that it's very important, though sometimes the discussions are very complicated and maybe governments do not like certain criticism, but I think this kind of feedback is really important for us, but also for you to shape and address problems as they are appearing, and because they can really develop into major challenge which later might be impossible to address. And we believe, once again, the societal participation is crucial in contributing to sustainable and inclusive governance. The EU should further develop its role, I believe, not as really some kind of teacher, but possibly as an honest broker in this regard between civil society and your governments. Once again, understand me correctly, we do not want to push forward our models and solutions, but I think by sharing experiences and useful practices which helped us to be on the current level of prosperity, I think this might help also you not to repeat our mistakes and do things maybe even better than we do. I think there are many things, including we would like to learn from Central Asia on how to promote a tolerant Islam as really religion which can bring people together rather than divide them, which, as you see, also is happening in our societies. We see a major constraint in standing up to the crisis, and it is namely a weak digitalization in Central Asian countries, which undermine both governmental and societal efforts to address the pandemic. And among the several implications of weak digitalization, it is also limited access to reliable information. It was revealed to be a serious problem in dealing with the pandemic in individual countries. It was highlighted in the forum that vulnerable groups, including people with disabilities, have been most affected by the crisis. But I will come a little bit later to some other groups which were forgotten and which need to be really approached and also helped. As it was reported in the roundtable on persons with disabilities being already an underprivileged group, persons with disabilities face several additional challenges, including limited access to information and interruption of their medical care and many other services, which of course you understand better that in this situation, really these people were suffering a lot. As weak digitalization in the Central Asian countries turned out to be a serious constraint in standing up to the crisis, the session also paid specific attention to how increased digitalization can mitigate the effects of the current crisis. And among other things, it was highlighted that digitalization is essential for helping vulnerable people, including people based in rural and remote areas, as it provides them with opportunities to stay informed and to get very important life-saving support. In this regard, we believe the governments will need to further invest in providing their services through digital channels. They will also need to invest in better internet connections and more affordable internet connections, including in remote areas. This could be done through public-private cooperation, as well as with the financial support of international donors like the EU. But first of all, it's really homework which needs to be done by you, by your governments. And more broadly in Central Asia, the population had limited access to information and was faced with a lack of scientifically approved, verified information during the COVID-19 pandemic. This was one of the observations made by many of your friends in Central Asia. As highlighted in the roundtable on media, this was mainly due to the inability of state agencies to provide official data on time, and in some cases, deliberate attempts by governments to conceal the scope of problem. And people from rural areas, once again, and from vulnerable groups were disproportionately affected due to their limited access to the internet and insufficient reliable news content in local languages. Moreover, across the region, the pandemic negatively affected freedom of expression. And it was highlighted that in some countries in Central Asia, governments took advantage of this crisis to curb freedom of expression. I do not want to sound as too critical, but these were observations coming from the field, from your people. And we had the same problems in many areas, and we need to retune our mechanisms of sharing information, because also many things were disrupted during that situation. And our High Representative very clearly mentioned that, of course, we understand, and we did it also, that at certain situations, certain human rights were limited in use to address the pandemic, but it should be only very temporary kind of development, and only when it's needed to address the issues of pandemic. And this should be something we should better understand and transfer into practical life, because you know, once again, we are learning by doing, and that really this is something where a dialogue, where a communication with civil society might help. What I see as very important in the report, that it is focusing once again on many vulnerable groups. And we see that, as I mentioned, one of the forgotten communities is a community of labor migrants, and their fate during the pandemic was very, very difficult. And I believe, once again, this was a group disproportionately affected by the crisis. And migrant workers, as I've seen it in many reports, were mostly mentioned in the context of shrinking remittances. And unfortunately, when they return home, and this is a figure which I have from UNDP, they registered like 500,000 migrant workers which return back to their homes. A little attention is paid to them. They are not part of the social protection by the host country, and neither their home country, their host country, and neither are under care, under social welfare system of their home country. And they are stranded on the borders, unprotected. You've seen how many were on the border between Russia and Kazakhstan for a long time, and other borders. And this is creating enormous grievances, and thus they are becoming an easy target of recruitment by extremist organizations and many other things. And indeed, we see an interesting phenomenon, but you can correct me because I'm not a specialist on this. When most of people who were joining ISIS from other regions, including from Europe, from our countries, they were joining ISIS on ideological ground, while recruits from Central Asia were lured into ISIS net based on economic incentives and misinformation. And I believe the EU needs to do more in helping our partners to address those challenges in a comprehensive manner. Otherwise, I believe problems of Central Asia will become EU problems. And I'm pleased to know that yesterday, the European Commission has adopted its counterterrorism agenda, which will open new possibilities for value-based partner cooperation in fighting terrorism, including its root causes. And I'm glad that these findings in your report are further enriching our discussion based on interviews with those who experience these problems and grievances. And I believe direct communication and evidence-based research is the best way for shaping efficient responses for addressing those challenges. Prevention of root causes, drivers of radicalization leading to violent extremism. So I will end here. I was speaking for too long, but I think it was important that I pass these messages through you. And we are doing it very openly in all levels and in all our mechanisms of dialogue. So there was nothing secret in it. And I look forward to learning more about the findings from you who worked on it. And I wanted to really thank Andreas Scharbeck and who else? Yeah, Andreas. Yeah, 3 people were working on it, but sorry for forgetting one name. Yes, I see Andreas Manasis, Scharbeck, Juraev, and Samuel. Yes, Samuel was forgotten in my list. Yeah. So once again, I look forward to the discussion, to presentations from people who are working on this very important research. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Ambassador Burian. Thank you. It's always a pleasure to have you in our events, and thank you for supporting and being with us. So I would invite Mark Friedrich, FPI2 Head of Unit, European Commission. Mark, thank you again for being with us and for your support, for being our ambassador in the European Commission. So Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you all today to launch the report on the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 and media consumption among vulnerable communities in Central Asia. It's a particular pleasure to do that together with Ambassador Burian and Ms. Ginsberg here for us in Brussels on this relatively grey morning. I think when we first started thinking about undertaking this work, which is not that long ago, in April, I don't think we would have thought that by now we would be able to come up with products that are as specific and as well formulated as what we're seeing here today. So the first thing that I want to do is very much thank the colleagues from Internews, but also from the European Neighbourhood Council for the immediate reaction that you have shown when the epidemic first started, to try and make sure that the potential outcomes of this pandemic are anticipated in the joint work that we have been doing together for some time already. So looking specifically at the information needs of labor migrants and their families, refugees and ethnic minorities affected by the COVID-19 pandemic across Central Asia. I think one element that Ambassador Burian was referring to just now is one that is important here, and that is the issue of how much the pandemic has brought the issue of disinformation into all societies around the world. I can certainly tell you that much of what is in the report resonates from discussions that I have with my own family at the moment, where I oftentimes wonder where my mother and others in the family are receiving information from, and I'm quite surprised about how that information is used and understood. So it has an effect on all of our lives. And I think the way that you are working on it helps us very much to better understand how this information works, how the manipulation of information is used. So I think in that respect, the work that you are doing to support the media, to support civil society organizations, but also government institutions, religious leaders, and active citizens in Central Asia is incredibly important to ensure that information is used to encourage a constructive dialogue, even a controversial, conflictual dialogue where that is necessary, but is not used to undermine democratic institutions or indeed to advocate violent extremism. That's an objective that fully resonates with the EU Central Asia strategy that Ambassador Burian has already spoken about much more eloquently than I could do here. I just briefly in this context want to flag some of the highlights of what you have already achieved in the work so far, not specifically now under the study, but under the project. And I feel that the training of the 165 Central Asian journalists and bloggers and civic activists and press officers on conflict sensitivity is certainly something that I hope readers, listeners, and viewers in Central Asia will notice with time in quality outputs. I think also that the challenges that media in the region are facing to report accurately on COVID-19 have been addressed through your project by creating more than 100 pieces of content on evidence-based information about the pandemic so far. You've also engaged very much so with youth, for example, through the Ideas Challenge, the Idea Fests, where more than 400 socially relevant project concepts were developed, and about 100 of these so far are being further transformed into projects that participants can now take further for funding. Now, I don't want to extend myself further because you know those kinds of achievements much better than I do, so I don't need to refer those back to you. I think the research study that we will be listening to today and we'll be hearing about more today will further nuance our appreciation of the problematic in Central Asia. It provides significant findings and is data-driven in its recommendations. And I think there is indeed a strong need to increase the capacity of journalists, supporting the interdisciplinary training for journalists, not least in the production of social media content for vulnerable groups. I think also what the study shows very clearly is the need for support across regional media cooperation. I want to express my gratitude to everyone who's present here today. Thank you for your participation and engagement. We hope that the reading of the report is going to be encouraging to all of you to be relying as much as possible on evidence-based analysis, looking at how COVID-19 can have a very strong impact, usually much stronger than the average on vulnerable communities, and to particularly look at how they perceive and interact with media content. We hope that you find this report interesting and useful, providing insights that are directly applicable to the efforts that you are making to reach out to vulnerable communities, and that they will help in terms of preventing these groups from becoming easy targets for disinformation. Last but not least, coming at the end of the year, that has been unprecedented, I believe, for all of us. I think what we want to achieve is really that we try and recover better from COVID-19. And here we really want to make sure that we do all work together. Civil society in Central Asia and in Europe, with the United Nations, with regional organizations and national governments. That is what we must strive for, and I very much look forward to hearing about your discussions today and wishing you all the best for those discussions, and then for a happy end of the year and hopefully a happier start to 2021. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for your warm words and for the welcoming. It's usually, we are always happy to see you and feel that we have such support in the Brussels, the friends of the project. Thank you. And then to close this opening session, I would like to give the floor to Jody Ginsberg, Internews Chief Executive. Jody, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Farhad. Friends and colleagues, I'm really delighted to be with you today in what's actually my first simultaneous translation Zoom meeting. So it's very exciting. At this event, I have the honor and privilege to represent Internews, a women-led international non-profit organization with a long history in Central Asia, supporting the creation of diverse, high-quality media that serve the public interest and promote, as we've heard, vibrant civic dialogue across all communities. Our emphasis very much at Internews is in amplifying and empowering local voices. So it was fantastic to hear Ambassador Burian referring to the importance of supporting local organizations post-pandemic. And I very much hope that's something that we can see more of from institutions in 2021 and beyond. And of course, if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that access to trustworthy and accurate information isn't just a public good, something that we have known for a long time, but it can genuinely save lives. And that's why I think this report is so important. The research report we're discussing today has been produced within our EU-funded project that aims to strengthen resilience to radicalization and disinformation in Central Asia. For the last several years, with the support of the European Union, Internews has been advancing media literacy and cross-border collaborations between journalists, activists, state authorities, and religious leaders to promote peace and stability in the region through accessible and engaging content. And I think it's really very much that holistic approach that is key. With this report, it's our ambition that journalists and media houses from Central Asia will use the report as a reference point in their own publications and projects covering vulnerable communities. The research, and it is data-driven as we've heard, fills the gap of evidence on how labour migrants, refugees, stateless people and ethnic minorities have been affected by the pandemic and how they're staying informed throughout this challenging period. And surprisingly, the research shows a need to maximise opportunities for different ethnic groups to access trustworthy and engaging information on COVID in their native languages. That's something we hear time and time again globally, that why we might have information in national languages suitable for large populations, it's often the minority communities that miss out during a pandemic with the life-saving information that they need. I really hope that this report will inform the communication strategies of various stakeholders, including governments and the international community, and will encourage journalists and content producers to use their platforms in creating people-centered stories and making the voices of the vulnerable heard. I want to express my deep gratitude to our partners, the European Neighbourhood Council and the European Union, for what has been an excellent collaboration between the organisations. And now let's get to the meat of today's meeting. I want to pass the floor to our colleagues from ENC to present the findings of this research. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody. Thank you for your well remarks. And then before giving the floor to our speakers, I would just to stress the small rules for them. It's we worked with my son. So speakers, you will have 3 minutes left. I will show you, and then 1 minute left, so that we are all on time. So it's small artwork. Okay. Without any further ado, let's give the floor to our first speaker, presenter today, Samuel de Westerberg. He is Managing Director at the European Neighbourhood Council and specializes in Turkey, Central Asia, and Middle East. He oversees ENC research projects across the neighborhood in Central Asia, including academic council members and regional strategy. His research is focused on EU-MENA and EU-Turkey relations in trade, accession, energy, migration, and regional neighborhood policy. He is the author of numerous research studies, including Palgrave, Macmillan's Managing Security Threats Along the EU's Eastern Flanks. Samuel, welcome. Can you please give a short summary of the methodology developed and used for the purpose of this study? You have 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. 3 minutes is not so much time to present. So I will just say thank you so much for everyone who spoke before, for all the high-level speakers who came, and for everyone who's at the event. About the methodology, the study is a rapid analysis of dynamic information ecosystems across Central Asia during COVID-19. So vulnerable communities were identified after a lengthy literature review and careful consultations with academics and field experts, both from ENC, but also from across the Central Asia as well. We are, of course, aware that other vulnerable communities also exist, and we cannot account for all of them, but labor migrants, ethnic minorities, and refugees and stateless people are particularly relevant for some of the same reasons which were mentioned by Mark Friedrich, Jody, Ambassador Buren before, which have to do with language, which have to do with socioeconomic vulnerability in terms of financial and income status, and also from the methodological perspective, because they were somewhat spread across the region, and one could make some generalizable findings in accordance. The objective was to understand and study the impact of COVID and on these vulnerable and very neglected communities at times. The study was in practice divided into a quantitative part and into a qualitative part. And the quantitative part included a survey, a data survey across vulnerable communities in Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. Turkmenistan was not included, unfortunately, due to some more difficulty in managing to work on the ground. And the survey was randomly, well, it included randomization of selected respondents, namely the three categories that I mentioned before, the target groups. However, I should also name that we could not randomize the inferences for the refugees and stateless people because the numbers are simply so small. So the statistically relevant and randomized part of the survey is related to the labor migrants and ethnic minorities primarily. We also, in terms of figures, we did a 2,000 response rate survey across the region. That's 500 per country, and labor migrants and ethnic minorities were approximately 200 to 230 of the respondents per country. So we could draw statistically relevant inferences with error margins. When we looked at a regional level or a national level, of course, these error margins changed. And I should also say that we paid special attention to rural and urban divisions, as well as to gender overall. Now, with regards to the second part of the study, we looked at 500 qualitative, semi-structured, in-depth interviews, which were also with the vulnerable communities, and we supplemented that with 120 interviews with what we call elite interviews with content producers, meaning journalists and bloggers from also across the 4 countries. We conducted these interviews using cluster methods and snowball methods, and really the reason for why we decided on having both the qualitative and quantitative side of the study is because we very much recognize the limitations of statistics, especially during a crisis moment and especially during conditions of social distances. And similarly, we also recognize the limitations and sometimes non-generalizable aspects of qualitative methods and findings, which are also limited by the pandemic. And this is the reason why we very much decided to use a cross-examination and a comparative method in which we basically exchange and compare between the numeric inferences and statistically relevant ones and the qualitative side of the study, which both include direct contact with the vulnerable communities and with the journalists who are considered elite interviews. And this way we had the opportunity to basically go back and forwards and see if findings were found on one side, were they also comparable and obvious within the other side of the method of the study. And this way we could eliminate what we believed was a non-inference or even a non-generalizable qualitative finding with regards to the study. I think I have maybe spoken enough. Maybe I will just say
Yeah.
one last thing,
Okay.
which is that we, of course, conducted this study in multiple languages, in Russian and each of the national languages across Central Asia, as well as in the most frequently used minority languages across vulnerable communities like refugees and stateless people, meaning Pashto, Dari, Urdu, and so forth. I'm happy to answer any further questions about the methodology in the Q&A, for example. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel. So for those who have already questions and the comments, please do post them on the chat here in the Zoom. And then those who are watching us on the Facebook, put your questions in the comments on the comment section below here. I'm following the feed on the Facebook as well. Okay, so thank you, Samuel. And now we are going to the findings. So the first chapter of the report is browsing the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 on refugees, stateless people, ethnic minorities, and labor migrants in Central Asia. So actually, back to you, Samuel, to covering this the first chapter. So floor is yours. You have 6 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, I will try to be as brief again. If you look at slide 1, I believe there is a PowerPoint available for everyone. You can look at the key finding number 1. Both domestic violence and gender inequality were reported across all vulnerable communities in Central Asia. Quantitatively, the study found that 20% more women reported unemployment compared to men. This was measured across all target groups and countries during the pandemic. Because it was so wide across such a number of target groups, it also had one of the highest levels of statistical relevance. We asked women how their situation was during and after, or towards the end of the quarantine. And in general, one pattern was clear, both in the qualitative and in the quantitative side of the study, which was a dramatic increase in gender inequality reported across all groups. In particular, the number of female labor migrants with uncertain work status increased by 12% during COVID-19. And if we look at Tajikistan specifically, very few labor migrants reported to be employed, female labor migrants. And here it's important to contextualize that this figure is quite dramatic, the level of unemployment there, and indicative of the general high level of employment, both in the country as a result of the crisis, as a result of gender inequality, and also because Tajikistan already has a high level of female unemployment. However, when it's compared to averages put forward by ILO or World Bank, we see that it's disproportionate during the crisis. Here, the important conclusion is very much that existing inequalities and vulnerabilities are shown to be dramatically exacerbated during the crisis. And also within the existing vulnerable communities, so for example, within refugees or within labor migrants or within ethnic minorities, we must subdivide the levels of vulnerabilities. And here it shows that women are a particularly exposed subdivision within an already very exposed and vulnerable community. Now, key finding 2 is very much the economic impact of COVID-19, which was most acutely felt by labor migrants in terms of unemployment and border closure. So both the qualitative and quantitative side, and also the content producers, report the difficulties for labor migrants due to remittance dependence, which was of course stopped while borders were closed and an insufficient amount of government support was provided to these vulnerable communities, according to the absolute majority of qualitative respondents. Ethnic minorities faced and still face extremely high levels of labor uncertainty. The socioeconomic roots of the protest in Kyrgyzstan, we believe through our ENC data, shows a pattern. And I will get into that in the next slide in a second. In terms of Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Tajikistan, they also reported high figures, which is likely to, or potentially also lead to unrest, potential crime, further vulnerability and fundamental socioeconomic change or exclusion. Now let's look at slide 2, where I will show you some of these basically statistics and findings with regards to some of the comments that were just mentioned. So here we're looking at the key findings from the previous slide, and particularly with regards to unemployment and uncertainty. It is 2 diagrams which symbolize and show this very, very well. There's a lot of more data which we also got out of this study, but I think this is particularly indicative. As you can see, reported employment and unemployment and uncertain labor status of ethnic minorities in Central Asia during the quarantine period confirms a drastic situation for these vulnerable communities. Looking at the first diagram here, ethnic minorities face the highest level of economic impact during the quarantine, with divisions emerging among different countries. In Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, the unemployment rates among ethnic minorities were reported to be extremely high at 74% and 55% respectively. In Kyrgyzstan, ethnic minorities also reported high unemployment levels at 43%, whereas Kazakhstan saw among the lowest levels of unemployment, but which were at 32%. The second diagram shows the precise identical situation, but with regards to labor migrants. Labor migrants consistently faced very high levels of economic impact during the quarantine. In Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, levels of unemployment reported among labor migrants were 57% and 49%. In addition to unemployment, reported levels of uncertainty were also very high. Labor migrants in Tajikistan were reported slightly lower levels of unemployment, only 40%. I say only 40%, it's still very high, but lower comparatively. And in Kazakhstan, it was also quite low, but that is because we saw that they were reporting very high levels of labor uncertainty instead, which is basically in the survey mechanism defined as not knowing whether you have a job or potentially having lost a job that you had during the seasonal work. Now, the nuances from the qualitative interviews help us to show the differences that the statistics cannot always grasp. And here we look across the data and we cross-examine the data very carefully, and we see that the difficult employment situation, the financial status for labor migrants really had as a consequence the continuous reporting of lacking financial means to even purchase basic household products on many occasions. Labor migrants faced a lot of these severe difficulties with regards to even being able to purchase basic foods like vegetables and so forth. These were things that we unfortunately heard on several occasions. I will move on to my next slide, which is slide 3, which are the key findings with regards to the refugees and stateless persons. So here the first finding is very much that the refugees and stateless people remain the least educated, the most vulnerable, and 63% of the ones that were interviewed reported having low incomes. I'm happy to speak afterwards about how we define income levels, but low income really means very low income. And also only 1% reported undergoing university education. During the quarantine period, 48% of refugees and stateless persons did not work, while 13% had undetermined labor status across all of Central Asia. As a result, only 39% of refugees and stateless persons had employment status during the quarantine period. And when we look at these statistics, which gives us, let's say, a gross indication, we have to also look at the qualitative side. And here it was very much regularly reported that the refugees and stateless people continue to be the invisible group, the ones that suffered from the reported levels of most dire economic situations among the 3 vulnerable communities that we studied. And when we spoke to content producers, who of course have an overview with regards to the situation because they're journalists and bloggers, many reported that they were also much less represented in the media and indeed more invisible, as has been mentioned before again. I think it's therefore important maybe on this point just to conclude that the refugees and the stateless people both faced a disproportional economic impact and uncertain legal or precarious status because of their statelessness, while also facing linguistic difficulties, as was mentioned before as well, and will be mentioned by my colleagues afterwards and authors, both in the local and national media. Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel. Just about the time. I think a little bit longer.
I tried my best.
But before jumping to the next speaker, a quick question for you. So in terms of the socioeconomic impact, did you see any significant difference when you looked like at age, poverty levels, or any other factors?
Okay, yeah. So when we did the study, we very carefully made sure to create stratification. We divided our study, taking into account several subcategorical factors, including the urban-rural divide, gender. We looked at income levels, and we looked at age. We had various age brackets. And all data points towards the fact that gender is worst hit. Across the survey, we see that age is really that gender is really the top one, and this is very much backed up also by a lot of the qualitative study. This is followed by certain age demographics, usually middle-age demographics, are also hit disproportionately. And then I think the most important one to mention, which we also just saw continuously, was lower income levels have it the hardest. And one thing that we were also, I don't know if it's the right word to say surprised, but urban living, in fact, showed a higher degree of vulnerability and difficulty compared to rural counterparts, which we found very interesting. Maybe it's also important to say that both labor migrants and ethnic minorities, specifically in urban areas, qualified as more vulnerable in terms of actual employment status compared to their counterparts living in rural settings. So this is from the survey, and then 12% more labor migrants living in rural areas across Central Asia reported employment status as opposed to urban labor migrants residents. In Uzbekistan, ethnic minorities living in rural areas were 19% more likely to be employed compared to the urban counterparts. So we really saw a pattern of actually urban vulnerability, and urban vulnerability specifically among the most vulnerable being very important.
Thank you, Samuel. Thank you. It's very fascinating results. So now going to the next chapter of the report, and it will be on the trends and patterns of media consumption among our target groups. So the findings will be presented by Andreas Marazis. He is project manager and head of research of Eastern Europe and Central at the European Neighborhood Council. His research is concerned with the post-Soviet space, particularly socio-political developments in Central Asia and the Eastern Partnership countries. Andreas is also associate researcher for the EU Central Asia Monitoring, EUCAM. Please, Andreas, the floor is yours, so you have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Farhod. And I would like also to take the opportunity to briefly thank Internews for the excellent collaboration we had in this project, and of course, the European Union for their support in this project. And of course, last but not least, my two colleagues and co-authors, Samuel and Cyber, for the excellent cooperation we had throughout this research process. Now, in the limited time that I have at my disposal, I would like to draw your attention in the main trends in terms of media consumption across Central Asia, which are evolving around three key categories. Information channels, basically the media preferences of all three target groups, including which communication platforms they use, internet access and access information restrictions for vulnerable communities and content producers, and language preferences and availability for information consumption. Now, overall, the data from our survey and the in-depth interviews with vulnerable communities and content producers indicated a variety of media preferences, including traditional media, such as TV, radio, newspapers, as well as online media, including websites, social media, and messaging services. A priority was given to two main sources, TV and especially the internet. Both our qualitative and quantitative data indicated that there is significant proliferation of online media in Central Asia, and more specifically, the consumption of information through social media and messaging services. Interestingly, we observed that all vulnerable target groups saw very low levels of reliance on radio, newspapers, and people-to-people contact for information consumption. Now, allow me to share some figures with you from our big data survey. Across Central Asia, 57% of refugees and stateless persons report that TV is their main source of information, whereas 43% use social media, 20 online news media and blogs, and 18 instant messaging applications. Ethnic minorities primarily use social media, followed by online news and blogs and TV. What we observed is that the highest use of social media is reported in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan with 69 and 52% respectively, while TV ranks highest in Tajikistan with 52%. In Uzbekistan, the use of instant messaging applications is extremely popular among ethnic minorities with 55%. Labor migrants, and this is something that is also depicted in the diagram that you see in the first slide, across Central Asia report similar use of social media usage, around 45.5%, so as to access information, as well as online news and blogs and TV. Now, the differences we spotted are based on countries. For example, we have much higher number of labor migrants consuming information through social media in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, with 71 and 68% respectively, compared to Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, where the numbers are significantly lower, 15 and 28% respectively. Now, when it comes to communication platforms that the target groups are using, the proliferation of online media in the region, coupled with the fact that the majority of vulnerable communities use mobile internet to access information, explains why social media and instant messaging services are ranking on the top among the target groups. Instagram and VKontakte, which is the Russian version of Facebook, are overwhelmingly used by all three target groups. Refugees and stateless persons specifically use primarily Instagram, followed by VKontakte, Facebook, and Odnoklassniki. Instagram is also very popular among labor migrants in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, whereas in Tajikistan, migrant workers prefer VKontakte. Moving on to the instant messaging applications, all three groups prefer WhatsApp and Telegram. Specifically, WhatsApp is first choice in all four countries, with the exception of Uzbekistan, where labor migrants and ethnic minorities prefer Telegram. Let's move on to the next topic. Sorry, before we move on to the next slide, I just wanted to mention that all this information are backed by findings from our survey and the in-depth interviews with target communities and content producers. Now, the latter group also added that YouTube, Twitter, and TikTok are among the most popular social media platforms in the region, especially among youth. While instant messaging applications such as WhatsApp and Telegram were used for dissemination as well as for feedback purposes. Now, when it comes to understanding media preferences at platforms, we have to take into consideration several variables such as age, trust, and rural-urban divides. For example, ethnic minorities and labor migrants living in rural areas use TV as their main source of information. Across the region, older demographic groups are noted to rely more on TV news in general. And this is partly explained as a result of their lack of technical skills and partly because they are much more familiar with TV news. Moving on to the next slide. In terms of internet restrictions, the following findings were particularly relevant. And again, going back to some figures. 36% of the interviewed refugees and stateless persons reported internet restrictions in their country of residence, while 56% of ethnic minorities of Kazakhstan and 50% of Tajikistan indicated that they experienced restrictions in access during online research for information. On top of that, content producers, especially freelance journalists and independent media outlets, reported difficulties in gaining access to information and engaging with government officials in all 4 countries. There is a tendency that we witnessed among government officials to sue and prosecute journalists, especially when the latter investigate cases of corruption or when the reported content is considered to be very sensitive, such as interethnic tensions, religion, COVID-19, etc. Moving on to my final slide, and the last finding is language. So in terms of language, the preferences for information consumption among target groups favor consistently the Russian language, with the exception of Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. Now, according to in-depth interviews with target groups, ethnic minorities were the ones who mostly reported that they do not have access to local media or information in their local languages, with the exception of Russians. However, I would like to highlight that this was not mentioned by the respondents as a problem for 2 reasons. First, because ethnic minorities, as well as refugees and stateless persons, often speak either the main local Central Asian language or Russian. And secondly, because internet has also allowed people to access news in various languages more easily. Now, interviews with content producers revealed also that there is a geographic linguistic nexus in which Russian language news prevails in urban centers, while local language media is more common in rural areas. Nevertheless, there is a clear linguistic gap in terms of local news in local native languages among most ethnic minorities and refugees and stateless persons. I will stop here because I'm pretty sure that I exceeded the time that I was allowed to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. But nevertheless, so as a new tradition, a quick question for you too. So it was fascinating to see the different results on the sources and the platforms the target groups use, but what about the information itself? So what kind of information do they consume based on your study, based on your data?
Well, I will try to be brief in my answer. What we witnessed from our data survey and the in-depth interviews, we realized that ethnic minorities, labor migrants, and refugees and stateless persons are mostly interested in getting information about their country of residence, their own communities, and also there is a high level of interest in getting world news as well. What was surprising, at least for me, was that there is very limited interest in news from Russia. For example, only 5% reported an interest in news from Russia among refugees and stateless persons, and 6% only reported an interest in political information. Now, this is something that reported in the interviews with content producers. The majority of media outlets do not provide information related to Russia unless it's something directly related to Central Asia or something that is linked to information about labor migrants, such as border restrictions, etc., due to COVID-19. Also, surprisingly, COVID-19 related news did not score high among vulnerable communities, at least not as high as it was in the beginning, which is believed to be because of the general negativity and anxiety triggered by the topic.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you. So going to our next speaker, Shairbek Jurayev. So Shairbek is the president at Crossroads Central Asia, a Bishkek-based research institute. He previously served as deputy director at the OSCE Academy in Bishkek and dean of academic development at the American University of Central Asia. Shairbek has a PhD in international relations from the University of St. Andrews. He will present the last chapter of our report on the COVID-19 impact on media consumption and trust among refugees and stateless persons, ethnic minorities, and labor migrants in Central Asia. So Shairbek, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, Farhad. Thank you, everyone. It's great and nice and pleasure to see you all, even though from screen, including some old friends I see in the room. So this part of the presentation covers how the COVID-19, the global pandemic, impacted the media consumption patterns in Central Asia. And as a caveat, I'll be focusing less on the trends across various groups and more on making some qualitative statements on generic Central Asian patterns and trends. And second, also, I would like to remind everyone that the study took place, the data collection took place in May, June, July. And at that point, I felt that we are at the peak was March, the whole panic was March and April, and we're probably at the end of the pandemic period. But it turned out that the worst events were still in the future back then. A couple of points on why we should appreciate the impact of COVID on media consumption. Now, I think everyone is attending lots of conferences on the COVID impact, and COVID became a generic independent variable. So COVID impact on IR, COVID impact on remittances, on everything. So how it affects, how it relates to media consumption. First, the pandemic became a sudden, very unexpected and unknown source of danger to our physical well-being. So there's a health aspect here. And second is the economic aspects. The sudden change of way of life because of the government policies and restrictions on closing the borders, shutting the offices, forcing everyone to stay at home, brought dramatic change to daily lives. So the events of this scale inevitably will affect how people consume media. So to cut the story short, I'll just focus on several key patterns. Some of them will be more or less familiar to you, but nevertheless, I think if we speak of something that is obvious, that only stresses the importance. So the first big impact, and probably it was an immediate impact of COVID, and most likely also lasting impact, will be the greater consumption of news in the proportion of the overall media consumption. People started following news, well, as from February and March, when the panic started spreading. People were interested in general statistics. You remember then the COVID statistics was almost like following Premier League every Saturday, every Sunday. How many new infection cases, how many deaths, which country is becoming new hotspot, and so on. Also, search for medical protocols for advice on precautionary measures, and of course, the necessity to be updated about the government restrictions on whether quarantine is coming up or not, and so on. So everything this pushed people to follow the news much more than they used to in the past. Of course, it's important to mention that there was a reverse process. People started also saying that they were fed up with the general negativity of the news coming because everything was about COVID, everything was about deaths and so on. Some people mentioned stress, some people started mentioning distrust. So we can't believe in all of this news, and we'll come back to distrust later. So nevertheless, I think it appears that even though the news following brought down, but still it remains higher than in the pre-COVID period. So I think generally the society in Central Asia is now following daily news more than they used to. Second, and this is a smaller point, is that the Telegram, generally instant messaging services, turned out to be the biggest beneficiaries of the COVID-19. When the question was asked in the in-depth interviews, what new media outlets you started using because or during the COVID, these services, online media, came first, and particularly Telegram, at least in the part of research that I was overseeing, it was just very much striking. Also, Instagram and Zoom were also among the beneficiaries. Next slide, please. And here we come to one big question of the trust and distrust in media. So this is not a big topic ever since the U.S. elections. When Trump got elected, we know this how the various fake news make the news of the day. But the COVID-19, because of its scale, became a kind of litmus test on the trust in media. So here I would like to very briefly mention three areas where we see the discrepancies. One is that international media on COVID is being trusted more than local media. We see references to international news, but also international resources like Johns Hopkins website on the statistics and so on, often mentioned by the central agents as more trustworthy than what they hear from the local governments and local media. Second is online versus TV. There's a certain discrepancy between those who consider online media as untrustworthy, unreliable source of information versus those who consider television and radio, of course, /radio as unreliable information. So both of them, and this is two different opposite groups. Those who consider TV as unreliable tend to prefer internet and vice versa. And the final point on distrust is that there is a general consensus about the prominence of fake news, that fake news is everywhere. However, there's no consensus on what type of information is actually fake. So people equally say that there's lots of fake news, but then you see some people saying that the numbers are being inflated. In fact, governments are deliberately inflating the numbers of COVID-19 victims. And the next person actually says that the governments are underreporting, they are not capable of actually counting and so on. So the same piece of information is being qualified as fake by some and as to be trusted by others. I think this is a very important thing for media content producers and those who are in this field. So, and finally, of course, the debunking information or disinformation became a big priority for the content producers like editors, journalists, and this comes from the interviews with media content producers. Obviously, whatever they've been doing has not been sufficient. So there is still widespread notion that there's too much of information that we cannot trust out there. However, this has also been outlined and highlighted by media producers equally as media consumers. And the final slide is just here. Next slide, please. An illustration on one aspect of the internet level of trust in internet information among labor migrants. So as you see that the figures are very different. You have more of trust among reported in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan. Basically here, this figure should be seen in conjunction with data for other groups, but it's interesting that in Tajikistan you have uncertainty much higher than say in Kyrgyzstan, where there's quite rapid distinction between those who trust and those who distrust. And in Tajikistan, there's certainly more of distrust and trust compared in contrast to every other Central Asian countries. So there's a lot of information to talk about, and we can share with Samuel and Andreas on the questions, but here I will stop as being highlighted the key trends on COVID impact on media consumption. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharbek. Thank you. Interesting results. So again, a quick question to you before we move on to our final sessions, and we'll conclude our presentation and proceed with the question and answers. So what were the main demographic characteristics of the groups that had opposite view on fake news or media trust based on your data and the information you just presented? Please unmute yourself because we cannot hear you.
Sorry. I was just saying that I missed a couple of seconds of your speech, but I understood that what was the demographic of groups on consider fake and non-fake and so on. Here, there are several things. One is that the age is certainly a big factor. The older generation people are considered to be as more reliable, relying and trusting the traditional media, including the television, radio, and less internet. The issue of trust here, of course, correlates with the rate of usage. Older people tend not to be very proficient, fluent with using smartphones and so on. So the age is a big factor. And the second one that I would like to just highlight is probably that in Kyrgyzstan, there's clearly greater distrust in the whatever comes from the government, and whatever comes from the government is often correlates with the traditional media. So TV is often conflated by the perception of the government, because I think across Central Asian countries, you don't really have much of independent TV stations which would be critical of the government, while internet offers much more greater space for the alternative views. In Uzbekistan, for example, you have quite a high degree of trust in television, and some in the in-depth interviews, we could even hear that some people consider that television is more trusted, or should be more trusted, because some lawyers in Russian juristi check every piece of news that comes and broadcast by television. That is the direct quote. Basically, the perception among the population is that in TV you have trusted because there is the process of vetting and testing the news, while in the internet everyone can write anything, and that reaches the broad population. So in Kyrgyzstan there's less trust on TV. In Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, there's much greater trust on whatever comes from the TV and from the government. But then, of course, as Samuel and Andreas also mentioned, there is a kind of discrepancies if you look at particular groups of ethnic minorities versus labor migrants and so on. So yeah, and plus I think the rural population has traditionally greater trust in traditional media, plus on the information coming from the government compared to people in the cities.
Thank you, Shaherbek. Thanks. And then before moving to your questions, dear participants, and those who are joined us online, I would go back to Andreas very quickly so he could share with us the recommendations developed by the research group based on the research findings. So Andreas, if I may, you have 6 minutes.
I think I will try to stick to the timeline this time. So I would like to start by highlighting a few general observations before I move on to some of the key recommendations we provided in our report. Now, the findings from our study reflecting the impact of COVID-19 on media, information consumption, and the socioeconomic status quo in the region necessitate acting decisively and immediately. Now, the short to long-term implications for vulnerable communities include immediate consequences, such as declining levels of social security, as well as lacking awareness about healthcare. Now, due to the socioeconomic crisis, there is a potential risk of social exclusion, social unrest, and even radicalization. Now, the impact on the general population should not be underestimated as well. More generally, it is likely that the overall populations across the region will face a rise in unemployment, which is something that already is happening, and undocumented labor, which is something negative for the governments in the region, followed by increased populism and xenophobia. Now, the risk of not addressing the recommendations provided in this study is detrimental from a socio-political perspective and in terms of regional and national stability. So the lack of clarity and coordination of COVID-19 related information most likely will feed into the population's distrust in governments, while the level of general social grievances will grow if the population and the vulnerable communities continue to feel left alone to deal with and address issues related to COVID-19. Now, the lack or poor quality of access to information on the part of vulnerable communities will most likely create a fertile ground for actors keen to use the pandemic to radicalize such vulnerable parts of the society. Now, the recommendations we suggest are not exhaustive, of course, and we group them in 4 categories. First category is non-governmental organizations in Central Asia. We invite them to design programs and projects aiming at supporting people whose work and life routines were negatively affected by the pandemic, including socioeconomic and mental health impacts, as Samuel and Sarek mentioned. We ask them to facilitate meetings and act as intermediaries, basically, among researchers, journalists, and vulnerable communities, especially among minorities and refugees. We realize that cooperation among local NGOs and journalists in terms of reaching out to vulnerable communities will raise awareness about these groups' needs and challenges among citizens, donor organizations, and government officials. This was observed especially during the preliminary phase of our study, where it was extremely difficult to reach out to refugees. And also we urge them to support programs that give access or train civil society in internet privacy, use of VPN, to provide support to monitor internet restrictions and to give feedback and support advocacy against new restrictive measures. Second category is the governments of Central Asian states. We invite them to design a special communication strategy on informing the public on government measures to support households, private businesses, as well as on allocation of external aid or whatever assistance they have received. And this was something that, that derived also from the interviews with independent content producers who had difficulties in obtaining information from public authorities related to these topics. We also urge them to propose temporary economic incentives to all internet providing companies in their respective countries, something that was also briefly mentioned by Ambassador Burian in his opening remarks, in order to maximize the access population to quality internet connection, both for education and news awareness. We also invite them to hold closed-door consultations with civil society and media representatives in order to discuss and find ways to address sensitive issues such as radicalization, ethnic tensions among minorities, fake news, etc. This way, avoiding miscommunication and the spread of fake news. And this can be easily facilitated by international donor community, which is something that is one of our recommendations, actually, in an effort to provide accurate and science-based news to their audience and to combat disinformation. Moving on to the third category, we invite the international donor community present in the region to provide support to both government and civil society in their efforts to improve media and information access for the population, while coordinating the COVID-19 related assistance and transparency between the biggest donor agencies in the region, such as UN, the EU, the World Bank, and others. And something that was also mentioned by Mark and Ambassador Burian is that we need more support, financial support in research-based data collection with regards to vulnerable communities and their needs and challenges at a national, but also at a regional level. Finally, the fourth category of recommendations is targeting content producers in the region. So we invite them to maximize opportunities for different ethnic groups to access COVID-19 related information in their native languages. To develop also a coordinated approach among themselves on measures to minimize proliferation of fake news and maximize consistency of verified information on COVID-19, and participation in training or fact-checking that go beyond the official sources are also needed, as well as increased funding for media to survive beyond advertisement revenues, which is something that we witnessed in our interviews with content producers. Finally, we have seen that Instagram and VKontakte, two of the most popular social networks among vulnerable communities and especially youth, we believe that it makes sense for donor communities and content producers to place emphasis on training young journalists on honing their social media content production skills, namely on online media literacy and skills against fake news. Now, the full list of recommendations can be found in the report, of course, so I urge all of you to have a careful look in our study. Thank you, and I very much look forward to receiving your questions and comments. And I think I managed to stick to the timeline this time.
Yes, 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 I was just what to tell that. Yeah, thank you, Andreas. So we have actually a couple of questions. I don't see any question on Facebook. I guess everyone is expecting the report itself. This will bring a lot of questions, maybe, or the comments. But we would love to hear from you, participants. You can share them on our Facebook page, 3 значит, смотришь. For our European colleagues, you can share through the ENC your comments or the concerns. We could respond them. That would be nice. So today we have just a short intervention from Iqbal Isakov. He was referring to the big statistics of among the youth using the TikTok, which is kind of the next big thing, I guess, across the globe, and that it should be taken into account. And I saw Samuel's response. Samuel, do you want to shortly intervene by audio, just to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very relevant point. And when we were conducting the study, bearing in mind that we were doing the rapid analysis during the COVID pandemic, TikTok became particularly influential, especially in that period. And we therefore had an additional section in our survey for other applications. We could not mention all of them. And the other applications we now attribute when there is an increase in the other response, that it is probably TikTok. And as I mentioned in the comment that I made on the chat box, the only place where we saw a significant rise in the other category was really in Tajikistan. So it's safe to say that at least among the vulnerable communities, that's the country where TikTok potentially has had more of an impact as opposed to the other areas. And I think that corroborates quite well with also what Sharbek mentioned before.
Yeah.
If I may add on what I already mentioned about TikTok, since we have dealt a lot with interviews with content producers, we also came to realize that applications such as TikTok, which I must admit I haven't used myself yet, and Instagram and others are particularly useful for content producers, journalists, bloggers, etc., in terms of disseminating their content through short stories, short video clips, because these are the type of tools that are more attractive and appealing among youth in the region, among all target groups. I just wanted to highlight this one.
Thank you, Andreas. And we have a question from Ambassador Burian. Interesting question. How do levels of trust to different media compare to before COVID period? Has it changed? Who wants to respond to that question?
I can respond in part. I think also my colleagues will add some to this. So in terms of trust before and after, the way in which we looked at that was we had looked at some previous studies in the literature review and in the, let's call it the desk review and consultations that we had. And we based ourselves on that as anything before COVID, but we don't have an exact result as to whether the people that we interviewed, at least in the survey, increased or decreased their level of trust. Instead, what we focused on was trying to understand how different communities during the pandemic have levels of trust which differ with regards to different media. And here, for us, what was most striking was, again, age and gender and income. And specifically with regards to age and gender, these are the most important ones because it indirectly answers Ambassador Burian's question as well. So with regards to age, the younger populations showed the highest level of trust towards online media and also towards the towards online social media applications, whereas women showed also a substantially higher level of trust towards online media, and also towards the English language when receiving information. Now, why is that important with regards to understanding the before and after of trust in media or medias? It's important because when we look at the age demography, the demographic cone of Central Asia, it is quite a young demography, and also our consultations and literature review points towards the fact that there is a gradual shift away from more state-produced media and towards digital and online media. And hence, when we think about it all together, and also with regards to the qualitative findings, which I think Sharbek and Andreas will mention in a second, it is obvious that there is a trend which is moving us over, and that's guided by the youth demography, and hence we can assume that levels of trust are probably increasing beyond what we've had in terms of findings of different groups already showing high levels of trust during the COVID pandemic towards online and more new forms of media. Yeah.
Thank you, Samuel. Andreas, Sharbek, do you want to add something?
Yeah, just briefly to add, in fact, it's hard to make any claim about the pre-COVID and post-COVID. Okay, we're not in a post-COVID, but during COVID situations, because we would need a similar research to be done before the COVID. So what I can say from what I get from the in-depth interviews is that while we cannot say whether trust or distrust increased because of during the COVID, there's clear trend that the awareness of population about the problem of fake news or unreliable news, unreliable media outlets has increased. So COVID basically highlighted the problem. And this comes from the interviews when people just say that the government statistics are problems. So you see that if in countries and societies with already discredited or unreliable government sources, the COVID just adds up as another layer. In Kyrgyzstan, for example, people were distrusting, and in Tajikistan, simply on the basis of statistics, saying that whatever government says, 100 people died, just multiply by 3 or by 10 and so on. People were offering different advice, but a generic thing is that the COVID made them, again, remind that government usually lies, while it's not the same for all countries, of course. And of course, when people started discussing the medical part, what are the better ways to treat, or also geopolitical aspect of COVID, whether it's Chinese conspiracy or whether it's Americans who threw the virus into China. So you see that the COVID just gave life to all sorts of information, all sorts of it's kind of viral WhatsApp spam, which for the population, for those people who even didn't think of fake news as a problem, as an issue, they now started being aware and started filtering something as spam, or becoming victims actually, and believing that this is a great conspiracy and so on. So COVID highlighted the problem. Whether it's increased or decreased the trust, I would stop short of making a certain claim here.
Okay, thank you, Sharbek.
Very quickly say
Yeah.
that I'm not gonna maybe add so much in terms of like whether trust increased or decreased. What certainly happened during the pandemic is that the interaction between the audience and the content producers, the media outlets, has increased rapidly. So the use of the use of instant messaging services and applications like WhatsApp, Telegram, and others were used in order to provide feedback, in order to share their stories with content producers. In this way, they were able to express, their concerns, their needs, their challenges, and content producers, they were able to share more like stories that were like about affected populations, affected groups of vulnerable communities, and so on and so forth. So I think that, I don't know if this is more close to like the trust issue, but it's more about like source of formation, like people like labor migrants, ethnic minorities, sharing their stories with content producers and actually giving their feedback about these stories that are published.
Thank you, Andreas. So I will correct myself. So the question was not from Ambassador Buyan, but from Alina Belskaya, political advisor to the EU Special Representative. Sorry for that. So I don't see any questions on the chat. We have lovely likes and hearts on Facebook, which is good, which is nice. And then we are already close to our time. We started late, but I would use this opportunity to just proceed to our closing section so that we don't extend this session for too long. And then after that, I will share important information about how, when you will get the report. But before that, I would like to leave the floor for closing remarks to Ilhan Küçük. We're very thrilled to have us. So Mr. Küçük was re-elected as member of the European Parliament from the Renew Europe group in the European elections in May 2019. Ilhan is the rapporteur for Uzbekistan. He is also the first vice chair of the delegation to the EU-Turkey Joint Parliamentary Committee, as well as member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs. Thank you, Mr. Küçük, for staying with us until the end, and floor is yours.
Actually, I didn't stay until the end. I am with you, but I didn't follow the whole conversation because I was traveling. And it is very difficult indeed to travel. And right now I'm at the Sofia airport while I'm waiting for my luggage. I'll try to do my my concluding remarks. And I want to start by thanking European Neighborhood Council and Internews for publishing this very relevant and timely report. Thank you to other speakers and our moderator and many members of the audience today. And especially thank you to Samuel, Andreas, and Scherbek for this very comprehensive piece of research that goes into great details, both qualitatively and quantitatively. It is very relevant timing to focus on these vulnerable communities like refugees, labor migrants, and ethnic minorities due to the clear impact the crisis is having on them. It is also very important that the report dedicates such effort to better understand the impact on women, urban, rural divides, groups of different economic backgrounds, and of course, all of this through the lens of media and information. As a Bulgarian member of parliament, I can understand how important geography is today. At the time in which Europe is finding its role as a potential bridge between America, Asia, and the rest of the world, it is very clear why Central Asia is so important. Culturally mixed, geographically in between all worlds, and enormously diverse and rich heritage. Because we are all defined by our geography, and we have to remember that we are part of the same Eurasian continent in many ways. The challenges of Central Asia can quickly become problems for us in Europe, as we have seen with dynamic movements of illegal trade. Let me name terrorism, migration, and climate change. We are far from more connected than we think, and when we are hit by a pandemic, it is an illusion to believe that problems stop at the borders. COVID-19 definitely didn't see any borders, and it directly impacted the most vulnerable across Central Asia, which is first on ethical and principled duty for European to help and support our Turkic borders and brothers and sisters. But it's also a pragmatic and realistic choice, because the pandemic has led to suffering and poverty and closing of media and changing trends, which negatively affect people. And when vulnerable people are affected, they become victims of radicalization or crime, or simply fall into disinformation more easily. It is clear actually that we have to continue developing our relations, especially among researchers and civil societies. It's key that media and democracy is supported, but always within the framework of multilateralism, trust, and respect for one another. I hope that I can join one of your next invitations and to be present for a longer time, but also to be present with my face, because due to as I said, my travel arrangements today, I couldn't follow the whole event. And once again, thank you very much for inviting me.
No worries. Thank you, Mr. Kuchuk, for your intervention. And then before closing the event, I would like to ask maybe Ambassador Buryan, do you would like to have some final words?
Yes, it was an exciting discussion. I very much enjoyed really the observations which are pointing certain problems which we are not thinking previously about, and especially really vulnerable groups like minorities, refugees, and labor migrants usually are not exactly in the focus of our attention and so on, though we of course have this comprehensive approach and so on. But I believe also in this context, decreasing the potential for radicalization leading to violent extremism, it's more and more revealed and demonstrated that in case we'll not pay attention to those groups, then we have even a bigger problem and so on, especially labor migrants, they were mentioned. And simply, we need to continue working on the implementation of the strategy in all three directions: resilience, prosperity, and regional cooperation. And I believe really also this discussion is confirming the relevance of this strategy and the right vision which we had set a year ago in the strategy. But once again, it needs to be translated into concrete actions based on evidence-based research, based on the contacts with civil society, with researchers, with all elements of the society, reflecting these unique perspectives of all the players, stakeholders in our kind of coherent and comprehensive approach. So once again, thank you, Internews, ENC, and others who really were instrumental in preparing this report, but also for your continued work on media. Once again, I believe in the future, we'll come back to this topic, but not only. As I mentioned in my previous comments, but especially as it was agreed in our roundtables during the discussion preparing the forum, we want to encourage creation certain kind of working groups dealing with these particular issues in a more profound manner and feeding in the programs, feeding in also the preparation of our ministerial meetings and high-level political and security dialogue, which are the main platforms. But once again, there is a chance and opportunity to do things better, and this discussion is highlighting a couple of points where we could really do better and support our partners in Central Asia to move towards the resilience and prosperity. And here, once again, European Union will be and will continue to be a strong partner. So I look forward to your work, to interaction with you, and once again, hopefully we'll meet in person here in Brussels, or rather, I would prefer to already start coming back to your countries and have an interaction in real life with the real people. Thank you once again very much, and all the best to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Buryan. So the last point from my side before I will announcing when the reports will be out, if I may to ask anyone who is comfortable to turn on your video, because I want to propose to do a join photo. Now it is like in our new world, it's join screenshot. So let's have a join screenshot. Let's open your turn on your videos. So now we have a couple options. In a join screenshot, it's important to send the emotions. So we can have the like emotion, so you enjoyed the whole session. You can have heart emotion, which means we are so tired to be apart and we want to be all together. And you can have the thank you emotions for us, for the organizers, for the moderators. So any three emotions that you choose. Okay, so if everyone is ready, please join us, guys. Just turn your videos on and then pick any emotion you like. I will go with couple. Yeah. Okay. Don't be shy. Pick any. Yeah, we have hearts. We have thank from Ambassador Buryan. Okay, great. And then the team, I hope you guys did it. Yeah, okay, so we have it. Thank you. And then as I promised, the report in English version will be out in coming days. You can, it will be sent out to your to the emails that you use to register to this session. And also it will be available in the internews.org website, also at the ENC website as well. The Russian version of the report, since the report was originally prepared in English, we already adapting it, not translating, but adapting it into Russian. So it will be available in 2 weeks' time. I guess we will try to deliver it before New Year, so you have some kind of a present for us. If not, then it will be available early next year. But once again, when we have the Russian version, it will be sent out to your emails that you use to register. And also, please look at that package. You will also receive an executive summary. It will be a separate document, and also nice infographics on just we wanted to visualize some numbers, some findings, and some recommendations. So these 3 documents will come to your inboxes in coming days in English, and the Russian version hopefully by the end of the year or early next year in early January. Okay, thank you. This was it. Thank you for being with us. I would like to thank ENC, our partners, for doing this great job. And as I said, it was done during the pandemic. So it started in May and finished in September-ish, November. So it was very challenging. I would love to say just how incredible the work was done in timely. Many thanks to the European Union for supporting this project, for supporting this initiative. It has been a great journey for us. We hope we will continue together. So see you in our next events, hopefully in person sometimes. But before that, have a nice holiday seasons and take care.